Dr. Aliyah Kim sat alone in the observation deck, her silhouette framed against the vast, empty expanse outside the thick, reinforced windows of Odyssey Station. The alien landscape of Arctis V stretched endlessly beneath a dark sky, its surface split with jagged crevices, like veins of black ice. Faint blue flares of light flickered in the distance, the only indication of the planet's weak and erratic magnetic field. In the dim glow of her equipment, Aliyah was running her regular atmospheric scans, a part of her nightly duties. It was tedious work, processing monotonous streams of data in search of any anomalies. But tonight something was different. Her eyes flitted over the screen, and she noticed a faint irregular spike in the electromagnetic readings, an anomaly she'd never seen in her years on the station. She adjusted the sensitivity of her instruments, her fingers flying across the console. As she fine-tuned the frequency, the static began to clear, shifting from a chaotic hiss into something structured. It was like catching an elusive echo, a whisper trapped in the endless void. She leaned forward, her pulse quickening. The sounds came in waves, each one punctuated by a brief silence before beginning again, a cadence that suggested some kind of deliberate intent. Heart pounding, Aliyah pressed her headset to her ear, straining to listen to the faint, distorted sound that trickled through the speakers. At first, she thought it was merely static interference, perhaps caused by the fluctuations in the planet's magnetic field. But the longer she listened, the more the noise coalesced into something uncomfortably familiar. Words began to form, a fragmented pattern, a voice. The language was almost, but not quite, human. It wavered between tones as though the speaker were imitating speech without understanding it. A chill ran through her, prickling her skin with a cold, clammy sweat. She recorded the message, amplifying it to try and capture more detail. Her hands shook as she adjusted the settings. Each word or sound from the signal carried an unnatural weight, pressing down on her like an unseen force. The transmission grew in clarity, revealing a deep, resonant tone that lingered in the air long after each phrase ended. She had expected some static-laden chatter, perhaps an encrypted signal from a distant research vessel or colony outpost. Instead, she was greeted with words that seemed directed at her, as though someone or something on the other side knew she was listening. Her breath caught when she heard the phrase, distant yet unnervingly clear. Seek. Flesh. Seek. Vessels. The voice was warped, twisting in and out of pitch, sounding at once too close and impossibly far away. She didn't understand the words, but the intent behind them felt palpable, almost intrusive. Gripped by an instinctive fear, she hesitated, her finger hovering over the button to replay the recording. But a strange fascination took over, an impulse to decipher the message, to understand who or what was trying to make contact. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind her, but the observation deck was empty, its shadows silent and unyielding. Aliyah's mind raced. Protocol dictated that any anomalous signal be reported to the station's senior crew, but the idea of sharing this filled her with a vague sense of dread. Would they even believe her? Would anyone understand the peculiar horror this voice conveyed? She shook herself, gathering her resolve. She had a duty, and whatever this signal was, it couldn't be ignored. She opened a channel to the rest of the crew's quarters. One by one, her colleagues joined her in the observation deck, their expressions shifting from curiosity to discomfort as the message played on loop. Dr. Miles Anders, the station's senior commander, stood close to Aliyah, his jaw tight as he listened to the warped, unnerving words. "What do you think it is?" Aaliyah asked, keeping her voice low, almost as if speaking louder would somehow draw the signal's attention to her. Anders was silent for a moment, his brow furrowed as he processed the recording. "It's intelligent. That much is clear. It's trying to communicate with us. But the words, flesh, vessels, there's something about them. It doesn't sound like a standard transmission, it sounds like..." He trailed off, searching for the right words. "Like something aware of us," Dr. Howard Reyes murmured from the back of the room, his eyes wide. "Not like some random anomaly. It's targeted." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, a murmur of uncertainty rippling through them. Aaliyah tried to ignore the tightening feeling in her stomach, the sense that they were hearing something that was not meant for human ears. Dr. Anders shook his head, clearing his throat. "We'll respond. Keep it simple, formal. Just a greeting to acknowledge receipt." His voice was steady, but Aaliyah could see the slight tremor in his hands as he typed out a basic message. "Odyssey Station, Arctis V. We receive your transmission. Please identify." As the message was transmitted, a heavy silence settled over the room, each of them holding their breath, waiting for a response. But there was nothing. Only the hiss of static that filled the deck, cold and alien. Aaliyah and Anders spent the next few hours analyzing the transmission, breaking it down into frequencies, examining every nuance for clues. Despite their efforts, there was no clear answer, no comforting explanation. Just the same disconcerting phrase, pulsing through the equipment like a heartbeat. "We seek your vessels. We seek your flesh." Exhausted and unnerved, the crew finally dispersed, though Aaliyah could see the tension in their faces, the fear lurking just beneath the surface. They tried to shake it off, muttering about faulty equipment or distorted signals, but none of them truly believed it. Each left with the same tightness in their chests, a primal warning they couldn't ignore. As she sat alone again in the dim glow of her console, Aaliyah's eyes flickered to the darkened window. For the first time in her career, she wished for the thick, unyielding walls of a station without windows, a place where she could escape the endless, watching darkness of Arctis V. The night outside felt heavy, pressing in from every side, silent but filled with a lurking menace. Her gaze drifted to the communications panel, the signal monitor flickering with faint static. She thought of the alien voice, the echoing, unnatural words that had wormed their way into her mind. Every instinct screamed at her to sever the connection, to turn off the communications array and cut them off from the unknown entity out there. But duty and an uneasy curiosity held her back. Finally, after hours of silent dread, she recorded a log entry. Received anomalous signal. Message unclear. Contains phrases suggesting an awareness of biological entities. Crew response issued. No reply. Analysis ongoing. Awaiting further instructions. She hesitated before typing the last line, her fingers lingering over the keyboard. Her mind wandered to the voice, the dark implications of the words she had heard. Something had found them, had recognized them as human, and it was reaching out. Her chest felt tight, a creeping unease gnawing at her, and she wondered how far away that voice really was. 3 days after they had first received the alien transmission, the team on Odyssey Station found themselves plagued by a series of strange and unexplainable anomalies. The message had continued to echo intermittently through their equipment, fading in and out as if it were embedded in the very atmosphere of Arctis V. The signal had a haunting quality, like a ghostly heartbeat rippling through the station, its frequency just low enough to escape the conscious ear, but high enough to be felt. A subtle, sickening pressure on their minds. The temperature on Arctis V had inexplicably dropped, pushing their thermal regulators to the limit. Ice crystals clung to the edges of every window, even in sections of the station where the heat was set to maximum. The planet, cold and inhospitable, now felt impossibly foreign, as though the very air had thickened, laced with some unseen presence. Aaliyah could see her breath in the dim light of the mess hall as she sat with Dr. Anders and Lieutenant Harper, each of them pale and exhausted, their eyes haunted by sleepless nights. Every member of the crew was on edge, jumping at the smallest noises, haunted by dreams they couldn't remember upon waking. Aaliyah herself had taken to glancing over her shoulder, irrationally expecting to see something lurking behind her. As they sipped lukewarm coffee, the conversation drifted to their shared unease. Harper, usually stoic, was the first to admit what they had all been thinking. "Feels like we're being watched," he muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. His fingers twitched around his mug, knuckles white. "I know how it sounds, but it's like there's something out there, just beyond the perimeter, something circling us." Dr. Anders shot him a skeptical look, though Aaliyah noticed the tension in his jaw. "Let's not start jumping at shadows, Lieutenant," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "This is a harsh environment. Unfamiliar surroundings can play tricks on the mind." Harper frowned, but didn't argue. Aaliyah shared his unease, but she forced herself to focus on the facts, or at least what they understood of them. Still, each time she closed her eyes, she could feel that alien transmission crawling through her thoughts, echoing those three words: seek, flesh, vessels. They had repeated them over and over like a sinister mantra since the initial contact. She had just begun to respond to Dr. Anders when the station's alarm blared, a shrill and discordant scream that shattered the quiet of the room. They leapt to their feet, racing to the control center where Dr. Reyes, a soft-spoken geologist, was monitoring the exterior feeds. The monitor flickered as Aaliyah leaned in, catching a distorted image on one of the perimeter cameras. The feed was grainy, obscured by streaks of static, but through the interference she could make out something strange, a dark, irregular shape moving across the ice-covered ground toward the station. It was long and sinuous, stretching and contracting in unnatural ways, as though its body were made of something that defied human anatomy. Aaliyah's heart pounded as she squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of the image. The creature seemed to have no fixed form, shifting as it moved, one moment slender and skeletal, the next a mass of coiling tendrils that sank into the snow and dragged it forward. Her stomach turned as she realized the creature was headed directly for the station. "What? What is that?" Harper breathed, his voice tight with fear. No one answered. They were all transfixed by the horrific vision on the screen, their minds struggling to process the sheer alien wrongness of the thing. The creature reached the outer wall, and Aaliyah watched in horror as it pressed itself against the metal hull, a wet, slithering sound vibrating through the walls. It paused there as if listening, its formless mass pulsing against the steel as though it were tasting the station, probing its structure. She glanced at Dr. Anders, his face pale and jaw clenched, and knew he shared her fear. This creature was not mindless. It was intelligent. Aaliyah zoomed in on the image, her hand trembling as she adjusted the focus. As she did, she saw something that sent a wave of nausea crashing over her. The creature's surface was translucent, and beneath it, dark shapes shifted, writhing like veins of oil underwater. Something within it was moving, something alive, its dark tendrils twitching and coiling within the creature's body. "It's not just one thing," she murmured, barely able to find her voice. "It's a colony, or a hive, all connected, all part of a larger whole." They watched in silence as the creature slithered along the outer wall, leaving a trail of viscous, dark fluid that seemed to burn into the snow, eating away at the ice like acid. A horrified realization dawned on Aaliyah. Whatever this creature was, it wasn't just here by chance. It had been drawn by their signal. They had unknowingly invited it. "What do we do?" Dr. Reyes whispered, his voice tight with panic. Dr. Anders took a shaky breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "We need to isolate this thing. We can't let it breach the station. Harper, suit up. Check the perimeter for any damage or breaches." Harper nodded, though Aaliyah could see the terror in his eyes as he grabbed his gear. She wanted to object, to tell Anders that sending anyone out there was madness, but she knew they had no choice. If the creature managed to breach the station, they would be trapped with it. As Harper prepared to step outside, Aaliyah and Dr. Anders pored over the data from the atmospheric sensors. The readings were unusual, showing a rise in unknown particulates in the air. It was as though the creature itself was altering the atmosphere, leaving behind traces of its presence that lingered like a faint poison. A crackle of static interrupted them, and Aaliyah glanced at the radio. Harper's voice came through, strained and barely audible. "Found tracks leading from the perimeter to the station," he reported, his voice shaking. "They're deep, almost like claw marks, but no clear shape, just something dragging itself along." Aaliyah shivered, glancing at Dr. Anders, whose face had grown pale. Harper continued, his breathing audible through the radio. "There's a smell, like something rotting. Can't shake it. Feels like it's pressing down on me." He trailed off, and for a moment, the radio was silent, filling with nothing but the background hiss of static. Aaliyah clutched her headset, her heart racing as she waited for him to speak again. But all that came through was heavy breathing, interrupted by faint, wet sounds that reminded her of flesh being torn. "Harper?" she whispered, barely able to keep her voice steady. Then his voice returned, distorted and slurred. "It's here. I can feel it. Inside. It's in my head. Something's crawling under my skin." The radio cut to silence, and Aaliyah's blood turned to ice. She looked to Anders, who stared back at her, horror etched across his face. No one spoke. They could all feel it now, the claustrophobic, suffocating presence pressing in on them, closing off every exit. A sense of primal fear gripped the crew as they realized the truth. They weren't just being observed. The creature was inside their minds, threading itself into their thoughts, their bodies. It wasn't a predator. It was an infection, a force of pure malevolent intent that sought to consume and transform. Dr. Anders attempted to restore order, but Aaliyah could see the hopelessness in his eyes. Whatever had found them on Arctis V had come to them not out of curiosity or malice, but necessity. The creature was not seeking conquest. It was seeking life, new hosts, new vessels to spread and proliferate. As they turned back to the monitors, Aaliyah watched as the creature's form melded seamlessly into the shadows outside, as though it were dissolving into the very air, becoming one with the darkness. She realized with mounting horror that they couldn't see it anymore, not truly. It was all around them now, hidden in the atmosphere, a ghostly presence that had seeped into the very fabric of their environment. And in that moment, Aaliyah understood what the signal had truly meant. They had answered its call, and now it had come to collect. By the time the third night fell, Odyssey Station was bathed in darkness, a deep and suffocating blackness that seemed to pulse with its own unearthly rhythm. Every surface was chilled, a creeping frost that had leached in through the walls, no matter how high they adjusted the heat. The station felt like a tomb. The crew moved quietly through the halls, speaking in hushed tones, their faces drawn and eyes rimmed with red. No one wanted to sleep. Nightmares had begun to plague them all, fragmented visions of crawling tendrils and dark, yawning voids. When they did sleep, they woke screaming, hands clawing at their own skin as though they were trying to scrape something off. Dr. Alia Kim could feel it too, a subtle change beneath her skin, an uncomfortable prickling that seemed to run just below the surface, like an itch that couldn't be scratched. She dismissed it as stress, fatigue, anything but what her mind screamed at her to recognize. But her thoughts betrayed her, slipping back to the image of that creature outside, its translucent body crawling with dark, writhing shapes. She could still feel the weight of its gaze, as if it were watching her even now. The first real incident happened just before dawn. Lieutenant Harper had volunteered for the night watch, patrolling the East Wing. He was already unsteady, his skin clammy and pallid, but they couldn't afford to lose anyone else to sleep. Alaya and Dr. Anders found him slumped in a corner, trembling violently, his breaths ragged and shallow. His helmet was cracked, his visor smeared with a strange, oily substance that seemed to pulse under the light. Harper looked up at them with wide, glassy eyes. His face was drenched in sweat, and Aaliyah noticed with a jolt of horror that there was something wrong with his skin. Tiny black lines, like veins, were spreading across his face, just under the surface, twisting in intricate patterns. She touched his arm, and he recoiled as if her touch had burned him. "It's inside me," Harper gasped, clutching his chest. "I can feel it, moving, crawling. It's..." His voice cracked and he doubled over, fingers clawing at his own skin. "It's trying to get out." Aaliyah's stomach churned as Harper's nails dug into his own flesh, peeling away layers in frantic, bloody strips. Beneath his skin, something dark and wet shimmered, a network of thin, sinewy tendrils, coiled and pulsing, spreading through his veins and muscle like the roots of some invasive plant. "Harper, stop!" Dr. Anders grabbed his arms, pinning him down, but Harper fought with a desperate strength, his eyes wide and wild. "Can't let it take me," he gasped, blood trickling from his mouth. His voice was barely a whisper now, choked with terror. "We shouldn't have answered. It's in the air, in us." His voice trailed off, and with a final, shuddering breath, he went still. Aaliyah stared at him, unable to look away from the grotesque transformation spreading across his body. The black tendrils continued to grow, twisting under his skin, shifting as though they had a mind of their own. She backed away, hands pressed over her mouth, bile rising in her throat. The alien transmission had done something to them, something irreversible. Whatever this entity was, it had infected Harper, transforming him from within, turning his body into something grotesque and unnatural. And it was only the beginning. They placed Harper's body in quarantine, but the damage was already done. One by one, the other crew members began to exhibit similar symptoms: fevers, hallucinations, an insatiable itching beneath the skin. Aaliyah could feel it too, a strange tingling that started at the base of her spine and spread slowly through her limbs, filling her with an inexplicable sense of dread. Days passed in a fevered haze, with no relief. The sound of shuffling feet, muffled screams, and sporadic bursts of static from the communications console filled the station. No one spoke about what was happening, but they all understood. The creature hadn't needed to break into the station. It had found a way in through the transmission, threading itself into their minds, their blood. Aaliyah was beginning to lose time. She would blink and find herself somewhere else, disoriented and cold, hands shaking as though she had been out in the snow. Once, she awoke standing in front of the vent in the engineering bay, her nails bleeding from where she had clawed at the metal grates. She could have sworn she had heard something moving inside the vent, a soft, wet slithering that whispered to her in the voice from the transmission. The others fared no better. Dr. Reyes, usually so quiet and composed, had taken to muttering to himself, his words slipping between English and an unfamiliar guttural language that Aaliyah didn't recognize. She heard him one night, his voice low and strained, whispering about vessels and flesh. It was the same words from the transmission, echoing through his mind, his own voice sounding foreign and warped. Dr. Anders was perhaps the worst. He barricaded himself in the medical bay, refusing to see anyone, only emerging occasionally to check on the containment area where Harper's body lay. Aaliyah had caught glimpses of him, pale and emaciated, his skin stretched thin over sharp bones, dark circles etched beneath his eyes. Each time he emerged, he looked less like himself and more like something else. Something hollowed out, eaten from within. Then, on the fifth night, the creature made its final move. Aaliyah was alone in the main corridor when the lights flickered and died, plunging the station into darkness. She heard it then, the sound she had dreaded since that first transmission. It was a wet, slithering noise, accompanied by a faint whispering, a cacophony of alien syllables that resonated with the nauseating familiarity. Her body froze, paralyzed by the sickening sensation that something was crawling just beneath her skin, moving in time with the whispers. A door creaked open, and she turned, her breath catching in her throat. In the faint emergency lighting, she saw it, a shifting mass that slithered through the corridor, its translucent body reflecting the dim red glow. The creature was grotesque, its form constantly changing, limbs extending and retracting, stretching like sinewy threads of black fluid. But what horrified her most were the faces. Embedded within its flesh, just below the surface, were faint impressions of human faces, mouths twisted in silent screams, eyes staring wide and unseeing. She recognized them: Harper, Reyes, Anders. Their faces were half-formed, merging into the creature's body as though they were becoming part of it. The creature was absorbing them, using their bodies to build itself, to grow. Aaliyah stumbled back, choking on her fear. The creature moved toward her, its many mouths forming into one, a grotesque mockery of a human face that shifted and melted as it approached. She felt something shift inside her, a dark tendril winding through her veins, responding to the creature's call. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Her body was no longer her own. It was part of the creature, an extension of its will. She could feel her consciousness slipping, her thoughts merging with 1,000 others, voices trapped within the alien flesh, bound to the creature's endless, voracious hunger. In the final moments before her mind dissolved, she realized the horrifying truth. They had never been in danger of dying. The creature didn't want them dead. It wanted them as vessels, as living parts of its endless, amorphous body. Each of them would become part of it, their minds, their flesh, eternally bound within the alien horror that had found them. As the creature enveloped her, Aaliyah's last thought was of the transmission, the message that had called them to this place, this desolate, forsaken planet. They had answered the call, drawn by the thrill of discovery, the hope of finding something beyond themselves, and now they would remain here forever, their voices lost in the whispers of the creature, trapped in the dark abyss of Arctis V. The station was silent. An unnatural stillness hung in the air, broken only by the soft, relentless pulse of static that echoed through the empty corridors, reverberating off the cold metal walls. Odyssey Station felt like a husk, empty, forgotten, waiting to be swallowed by the darkness of Arctis V. Every console, every monitor, flickered in unsteady bursts of light, a dying heartbeat mirroring the final moments of its last inhabitants. Dr. Aaliyah Kim was alone, or rather, she was what remained. She couldn't remember the last time she had seen the others. Their faces were slipping from her memory, blurring like half-forgotten dreams. She had searched for them, called out their names, wandered through the empty halls, hoping to find a familiar face, someone who could reassure her that she wasn't the only one left. But all she had found was silence and the cold, pressing weight of something vast and unknowable watching her from the shadows. Her body felt foreign, as though it were no longer her own. Every step felt like a struggle, her muscles leaden, weighed down by an invisible force that pulsed with each step. She was no longer certain if the pain was real or if it was something deeper, something embedded in her very bones. Her skin prickled, itching with an insatiable need to scratch, to tear, to claw away at the invisible threads weaving their way through her body. But she resisted. She had seen what happened to the others, how they had succumbed to that relentless urge, peeling away their flesh in a desperate attempt to purge themselves of the creature's presence. She could still see Harper's glassy, unseeing eyes, his fingers coated in blood as he tore at his own skin, his face twisted in terror. Aaliyah stumbled into the communications room, her mind reeling. She was half-conscious, moving by some primal instinct, clinging to the thin thread of her own thoughts, her own identity. She could feel it slipping, that fragile thread unraveling, each memory fading, each thought drowned beneath the sickening, rhythmic pulse of the alien presence inside her. The console flickered, casting her face in a cold, pale glow. Her reflection stared back at her, hollow-eyed, a ghostly visage of the person she had once been. She could hardly recognize herself, the dark circles beneath her eyes, the gaunt, sunken cheeks, the faint network of black veins creeping beneath her skin, like roots of some foreign growth taking hold of her. She took a deep, shuddering breath, steadying herself. Her hand trembled as she activated the recording device, the small red light blinking to life. For a moment, she could almost pretend this was a normal report, that she was simply logging another entry, another routine update for the crew. But she knew better. This was no routine log. This was her last chance, her final act, a desperate attempt to warn anyone who might be foolish enough to answer the same call, to follow the same path that had led them here. She was speaking not just for herself, but for all of them. Each life that had been taken, each mind that had been consumed by the alien horror they had unknowingly invited. With a voice barely above a whisper, she began, her words thick with exhaustion and despair. "This is Dr. Aliyah Kim of Odyssey Station, located on Arctis V. If you are hearing this, please do not come here. Do not respond to any transmissions from this station. Do not attempt to contact us. We answered a call, a transmission that we thought was an attempt at communication." Her voice wavered, and she took a shaky breath, forcing herself to continue. "It wasn't. It was a lure. A beacon drawing us in, calling to us with a voice that wasn't ours, that was never meant for us. The signal. It's not a message, it's a contagion, a way in. We thought we could understand it, that we could make contact. But all we've done is open ourselves to something we were never meant to know." She paused, swallowing the bile that rose in her throat. The memories were slipping, her thoughts muddled, but she pushed on, clinging to the fragments of her own mind, her own voice. "They're gone. All of them. Harper, Reyes, Anders. They're part of it now. I don't know how else to describe it. It doesn't kill. It doesn't destroy. It consumes, piece by piece, mind by mind, until there's nothing left. It's in the air, in the walls, in every breath we take. It's a living presence, a hunger that devours everything it touches." Her voice broke, and she felt the tears streaming down her cheeks, hot and stinging. She had never felt this helpless, this utterly alone. There was no escape, no salvation. They were already part of it, bound to this alien presence that had woven itself into the very fabric of their minds, their bodies. She wiped her eyes, her hand trembling as she forced herself to finish. "I can feel it now, inside me, crawling, spreading. It's not just a creature, it's something more, something ancient, something that has waited in the dark, reaching out across the void, searching for vessels, hosts." Her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms as she tried to hold on to the last shreds of her humanity. She could feel it, that final sliver of herself slipping away, drowning beneath the overwhelming presence that pulsed within her. Her thoughts were blurring, her memories fading, replaced by alien whispers that echoed in the back of her mind. Aliyah leaned closer to the microphone, her voice a choked, desperate whisper. "Please, if you find this, don't let us be remembered. Let us be forgotten, lost here, in the silence of Arctis V. Don't answer. Don't come. It wants more. It's never satisfied. It wants to spread." She felt the creature's pull then, a sickening, irresistible force tugging at her consciousness, urging her to surrender, to let go. Her fingers trembled over the console, her mind slipping further into darkness, each thought dissolving like mist. With a final, gasping breath, she whispered, "End of transmission." Her hand dropped to her side, her vision blurring as she felt the alien presence take hold, consuming the last fragments of her mind. She was no longer Dr. Aliyah Kim. She was no longer herself. She was part of something vast, something endless, a voice in the darkness, a mind lost to the pulsing rhythm of the creature that had claimed them all. The console flickered one last time, and then, in a burst of static, the transmission was sent, drifting out into the cold silence of space, a warning carried on the faintest of signals, echoing through the void. As the last traces of Aaliyah's consciousness faded, a single haunting thought remained, lingering like an ember in the darkness. It would not be alone for long. And somewhere, light years away, in the depths of space, the transmission found its way to another receiver, a distant listening post orbiting a desolate moon. A faint, distorted signal crackling through the console, a whisper from the abyss waiting for someone, anyone, to listen. The station fell silent, its lights dimming, swallowed by the darkness of Arctis V, where it would remain. A grave, a warning, a ghostly reminder of those who had answered the call and found only the endless, hungry silence of the void.